Diego Maradona was one of the greatest footballers of all time, but his most shocking story began after his death. His children thought they were inheriting millions. Instead, they found missing assets, fraud allegations, bitter family feuds, and a battle that would last for years. Here's how it all unraveled. The Empty House and the Vultures. On November 25, 2020, the most famous man in Argentina died in a rented house, not a palace, not a mansion with his name on the gate, a rented home in a gated neighborhood called Tangled, just north of Buenos Aires, where he was supposed to be resting and healing. He had gone through brain surgery only 3 weeks earlier, and the plan was simple: recover quietly, get strong, come back. Instead, he was found unresponsive in his bedroom around midday, and by the time the world heard the news, the man they called El Diego was gone at 60 years old. You can read the basic details of that day in the BBC's report on his death, and they are stark. A quiet room, a medical team that was supposed to be watching him, and a body that told a much darker story than anyone expected. But this video is not about how he died, not yet. This is about what happened after, because the moment Diego Maradona stopped breathing, a countdown started. And it was not a countdown to peace, it was a countdown to war. First, understand what his death meant to an entire country. Argentina did not just lose a footballer, it lost a saint. The government declared days of national mourning, and his body was brought to lie in state at the Casa Rosada, the pink presidential palace itself, the kind of honor usually reserved for heads of state. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets to say goodbye, queuing for blocks, weeping, singing, blowing kisses at a coffin draped in the blue and white flag and his famous number 10 shirt. Fans chanted the old World Cup song. Stadiums lit their floodlights at 10 at night, a salute to the number he made immortal. And at times, the grief turned to chaos, with police and mourners clashing when the crowds could not all get in. That is who Diego Maradona was, a man so loved that a nation nearly shut down to bury him. And when a man like that dies, whatever he leaves behind is not just an estate, it is a prize. Now here is the first real shock, and it is a big one. The man who earned more money than almost any footballer of his era, the man who signed world record deals and sold his face to giant brands, that man died without leaving a will. Nothing written down, no instructions, no list of who gets what. Lawyers have a cold word for this. They call it dying intestate. For a normal person with a normal life, it is a headache. For Diego Maradona, it was a bomb. And you have to stop and ask the obvious question: how? How does a man like this, a man who had lawyers, managers, and advisors around him for 40 years, a man who knew he was sick, who had survived heart scares and hospital stays, how does that man leave nothing written down? He had every reason to plan. He had a blended family, children from different relationships, valuable assets, and a history of bitter fights over money. If anyone on earth needed a clear, ironclad will, it was Diego Maradona. And yet there was nothing, no document, no final wishes, just silence. Was it denial, a man who could not bear to imagine his own death? Was it chaos, a life too messy to ever pin down on paper? Or, as some would later wonder, was the missing will not an accident at all? Hold on to that question, because the answer, or the lack of one, sits at the very center of everything that followed. Why? Because of who he was, and because of how Argentine law works. In Argentina, you cannot simply cut your children out and hand your money to a friend or a charity. The law says that children are what is called forced heirs. They are first in line, and they are entitled to the large majority of the estate, no matter what you say. So the second Diego died, his children became the owners of whatever he left behind, all of it split between them. That sounds simple. It is not simple at all, because there was one question hanging over everything, and nobody could agree on the answer. How many children did Diego Maradona actually have? Officially, the number most people used was 5. 2 daughters from his marriage, Dalma and Janina. A son and a daughter recognized later in life, Diego Jr. and Jana. And his youngest boy, Diego Fernando. 5 names, 5 heirs. But that number was never the whole truth, and everyone knew it. Diego had relationships with at least 6 women, and reports pointed to as many as 8 children in total, once you counted the ones from Cuba and the ones still fighting to be recognized. And here is where the story stops being sad and starts being wild, because within days of his death, strangers started coming forward. People the family had never met stood up and said the same thing: Diego Maradona is my father, and I want my share. 2 names came up again and again: a young man named Santiago Lara and a woman named Magali Gil. They demanded DNA tests to prove they were his children, and to get those tests, some claims called for something that made the family sick to their stomachs. They wanted his body examined. In some cases, that meant asking to dig him up and take a sample from a man who had just been buried, in a private ceremony right next to his own parents. Think about that for a second. His children were still crying at his grave, and already there were people lining up with lawyers, ready to open the coffin, if that is what it took to get a piece piece of him. This is what a fortune with no will does. It turns grief into a race, and the racers kept multiplying. Beyond the recognized 5 and the 2 loudest new claimants, reports described a swarm of people circling the estate. Ex-partners, siblings, distant relatives, old associates. When you count everyone who reached for a slice in one way or another, the picture is of more than a dozen people, all pulling at the same body of assets, all convinced they were owed something, and the race had already begun. Argentine law allows inheritance claims to start filing just days after a death, and one of his daughters, Jana, was reported to be among the first to take formal legal steps. Not out of greed, her side would say, but out of fear. Fear that if the family did not move fast, someone else would grab control of everything, before the children could even bury their father in peace. And here is the cruel part about how this works. Nothing could actually be divided right away. Not the houses, not the cars, not a single peso. Because before anyone gets anything, an Argentine court first has to officially declare who the legal heirs even are. That means untangling every paternity claim, ordering DNA tests where needed, and drawing up a full inventory of everything Diego owned, from properties to trophies to the value of his name. Only then can the pie be sliced. With this many children, this many strangers at the door, and this many assets scattered across the world, legal experts warned from day one that the process would not take weeks. It would take years. And every one of those years was another year for tempers to boil, alliances to form, and knives to come out. So now you have the setup, a dead legend, no will. 5 recognized children, and a growing crowd of strangers claiming to be more, everyone rushing to the same courthouse. Which brings us to the biggest question of all, the one this entire story is built on. What was actually up for grabs? How much was the estate of Diego Maradona really worth? And this is where things get strange, because when reporters tried to put a number on it, the answers were all over the map. Some estimates ran as high as $100 million or more. Once you added up the houses, the cars, the jewelry, and the value of his name. Other estimates were far lower, 10 million, 40 million. And some, as we will see, put the real cash figure almost unbelievably low. Nobody could agree, and the gap was not small. It was a canyon. How does that even happen? How can one of the most famous, most marketed athletes on the planet die and leave behind a fortune that experts cannot even measure? A man whose face was on billboards from Naples to Buenos Aires, whose jersey sold in every corner of the world. And yet nobody could tell you if he was worth 10 million or 100 million. The reason is that his wealth was a tangle from top to bottom. His assets were scattered across several countries. His debts were enormous and disputed. And the single most valuable thing he owned was not cash or property at all, but something you cannot easily count. So every expert who tried to add it up got a different total, because they were all guessing at pieces that were hidden, frozen, argued over, or impossible to price. That question right there is the thread that unravels everything. Because the deeper anyone dug into Diego's money, the less of it they seemed to find. The houses were there, but they came tangled with debts. The cars were there, but some had been gifts, and some could not even be sold. The bank accounts were a mystery. And the one thing that turned out to be worth the most, the thing that would eventually pit sister against sister and child against lawyer, was not money at all. One lawyer who studied the estate summed it up perfectly. He called it the hand of chaos, a nod to the most famous goal Diego ever scored, the hand of God. But this time the hand was not lifting a nation. It was tearing a family apart. And other legal experts saw it coming from a mile away. From the very first week, they predicted the estate would become a drawn-out mess. A knot of family feuds, foreign assets, competing claims, and secrets that had never been written down anywhere. They were right, but even they had no idea how ugly it would get, or how long it would last, or how far around the world the fight would travel. Courtrooms in Argentina, courtrooms in Spain, courtrooms in the United Kingdom. Frozen bank accounts, seized cars, sisters accused of betrayal, a lawyer accused of building an empire on a dead man's name. But before we get to the war, we have to answer the question that started it all. The question everyone assumed had a simple answer. Where did all the money go? Because Diego Maradona did not start out broke, far from it. This was a man who came from nothing, climbed to the very top of the football world, and got paid like a king along the way. He signed one record contract after another. Brands threw millions at him. For a while, he was one of the highest-earning athletes alive. So how does a man like that die, with an estate nobody can even measure? How does that fortune slip through his fingers? To understand that, we have to follow the money, all of it. From the muddy streets where a poor kid first touched a ball, to the stadiums that made him a legend, to the tax office in Italy that spent 30 years hunting him for a debt so large it would eventually swallow most of what he built. That is where the real story begins, not with the fortune he left behind, but with the fortune that quietly vanished long before he died. The fortune that vanished. To understand what Diego Maradona left behind, you first have to understand where he came from, because the size of his fall only makes sense next to the size of his climb. Diego was born into real poverty, in a rough shanty town on the edge of Buenos Aires, in a house his father built from loose bricks and metal sheets. There were stretches with no running water and no electricity. He got his first ball as a small child and never let go of it, practicing on muddy streets with a rag ball or an orange when there was nothing better. He once said the thing that drove him was simple. He wanted to ease his father's brutal factory work, and he wanted to afford basic things, like his own pair of trousers. That is where this story starts. A poor kid with a ball and a dream about pants. And then he made more money than he ever could have imagined. By the time he was in his 20s, Diego was one of the highest earning players in the entire sport. The money started early, and it kept getting bigger with every move he made. It began in Argentina, where as a teenager he was already a national sensation. In 1981, he transferred to Boca Juniors, the club he had loved since childhood, for a fee reported around $4 million. For South American football at the time, that was enormous. But it was only the warm-up. After the 1982 World Cup, Barcelona came calling and paid a world record transfer fee of around £5 million to bring him to Spain, the most any club had ever paid for a single player. And it was for that poor kid from the shantytown. His wages in Spain made him one of the best-paid footballers in Europe overnight. Then came Napoli, and Napoli is where the money truly exploded. In 1984, the Italian club broke the world transfer record all over again, paying around £6.9 million to sign him. Twice in 2 years, Diego Maradona was the most expensive human being in football. And in Naples, he was not just a player, he was a religion. He took a struggling club and dragged it to the top of Italian football, winning league titles a city had waited its entire history for. For that, they paid him like royalty. Reports say that during his 7 years at Napoli, Diego earned around $43 million in salary alone, a figure that would be worth well over $100 million in today's money. And that was just his paycheck, because on top of the salary sat the endorsements. And after the 1986 World Cup, where he carried Argentina to glory almost single-handed, Diego became a marketing machine. Brands could not sign him fast enough. At his peak, the endorsement money alone reportedly added somewhere between $8 and $10 million a year. Puma put his boots on shelves. Coca-Cola put his face in ads. Companies lined up to attach their name to his. In later years, the deals kept coming, from the watchmaker Hublot, who made him an ambassador, to the video game world, where his likeness lived on in games played by millions. Deal after deal, all built on the most magnetic name in the sport. So let us add this up. World record fees twice, a king's salary at Napoli, millions a year in sponsorships. By any honest math, Diego Maradona earned a genuine fortune. Tens of millions during his playing days, with some reports stretching his lifetime earnings into figures that sound almost unreal. Which makes the mystery even bigger. Because if he made all that, where did it go? The answer is layered, and every layer hurts a little more than the last. The first layer was simple: Diego spent. He spent enormously, and he gave even more. He was famous for it. People who knew him described a man who could not say no. One line captured it perfectly. When someone asked him for money, he gave it. Friends, family, hangers-on, strangers with a sad story. Money flowed out of his hands as fast as it flowed in. And around him grew an entourage, a crowd of people who lived off his fame, who traveled with him, ate with him, and quietly drained him. When you are the most generous man in the room, and the room is always full, the bill adds up fast. A lot of that generosity flowed straight to his own family. Remember, this was a man who grew up watching his father break his body in a factory for almost nothing. So when the money came, one of the first things Diego did was take care of the people he came from. He bought a home for his parents, he supported relatives, He lifted an entire family out of the poverty he had crawled out of himself. It was beautiful and it was human, and it was also, in a strange way, the seed of everything that came later. Because when your name is the reason a whole family has money, your name becomes something everyone feels they have a claim to. Diego spent his life being the source of the family fortune. And when the source was gone, the family was left fighting over what remained. Then there were the properties and the toys. Diego owned several homes in Argentina, with reports of assets stretching to places like Dubai and beyond. And he loved luxury the way a kid loves candy. Over the years, he collected expensive cars, a Rolls-Royce Ghost worth around $360,000, a BMW i8 worth around $175,000, a diamond ring worth another $360,000, and gifts that got stranger the more famous he became. At one point, a club in Belarus gave him an amphibious tank. Yes, a tank, a vehicle that drives on land and floats on water, parked in the collection of a football player. None of that comes cheap to buy, and none of it comes cheap to keep. Properties, cars, jewelry, all of it needs money just to exist. And slowly, the fortune he had built started to leak. Even in his later years, Diego kept earning. He moved into coaching and management, taking well-paid jobs around the world, including a reported six-figure monthly deal to manage a club in Mexico, plus stints coaching in the Middle East and back home in Argentina. The money never fully stopped coming in, but it was never enough to keep up with what was flowing out, and with the damage that his health and his habits were doing behind the scenes. Years of hard living took a toll, from hospital stays to surgeries, and every crisis carried its own cost in money and in lost opportunities. But spending and generosity and health were not what really broke him. The thing that truly ate the fortune of Diego Maradona was not a car or a party or a hospital bill. It was a bill of a different kind. One single, monstrous bill that followed him for 30 years and never let go. The tax man in Italy. Here is what happened. Back during his golden years at Napoli, Italian authorities came to believe that Diego had not paid what he owed on his income and, crucially, on his image rights. The money brands paid to use his name and face. They accused him of routing that money through proxy companies set up far away in a tiny country called Liechtenstein to keep it out of reach. Whether that was clever accounting or straight-up evasion became a fight that would outlive almost everyone involved. And the bill they handed him was staggering. By the late 2000s, Italian officials said Diego owed around 37 million euros. Once you piled on decades of interest and penalties. Some reports pushed the total even higher, and there were even references to a bankruptcy tied to the mess. To put that in plain terms, the tax debt alone was worth more than most people thought his entire fortune was. Diego refused to pay. He argued it was not his fault, that the club should have handled it, that he was being treated unfairly. And so the Italian authorities did what authorities do. Every time he set foot in Italy, they came for whatever he was carrying. Over the years, they seized his watches and earrings, literally taking jewelry off the man to chip away at the debt. Notices went out threatening to freeze his assets. And against a mountain of tens of millions, he ended up paying only a tiny fraction, reportedly around 42,000 euros, plus a couple of Rolex watches. A drop against an ocean. The case dragged on, year after year, decade after decade. It hung over him while he lived, and it hung over his estate when he died. That single debt is a huge reason the numbers never added up. A huge reason his fortune looked so much smaller on paper than it should have. And here is the twist ending to the tax saga, the part almost nobody expected. In January of 2024, more than 3 years after Diego died, Italy's highest court cleared him of tax evasion, ending the 30-year battle. His lawyer said what the family had claimed all along, that Diego had never been a tax evader. But by then it was far too late to matter. The debt had already done its work. For most of his life, that shadow shrank his wealth, blocked his cash, and left a cloud over everything he owned. So now put all the pieces together. Runaway spending, endless generosity, an entourage feeding off him, luxury that cost a fortune to maintain, years of health crises, and a tax war that swallowed tens of millions and never ended while he was alive. Add it all up, and you arrive at a number so shocking it seems impossible. According to Celebrity Net Worth, at the time of his death, Diego Maradona was worth roughly $500,000. Not 50 million, not 100 million, 500,000. less than the price of one of his own cars. The greatest footballer of his generation, a man who earned tens of millions, maybe more. And on paper, he died with almost nothing. And when the family tried to raise cash from what was left, the picture got even bleaker. Reports describe an auction of around 90 of his items, and it raised only about $26,000, with the big-ticket things like properties and cars going unsold. The estate of a legend, and it could barely move his belongings. And the debts did not just vanish when he did. Creditors and unresolved claims hung over the estate like a fog. Another reason the true, spendable value of what he left behind was so much smaller than the eye-popping career earnings suggested. This is why, over and over, financial writers have pointed to Diego Maradona as a warning sign. A textbook example of an athlete who earned a staggering fortune and let it slip through his hands. Fame does not equal wealth. A giant paycheck does not equal a secure future. Diego proved that in the most public way imaginable. He had the earning power of a superstar and the money habits of a man who still could not quite believe he was allowed to have any of it. So it seems open and shut, right? Diego Maradona died broke, fortune gone, end of story. Except it is not the end of the story, not even close. Because there was one asset the tax man could not seize. One thing that no auction could sell for scraps, that no proxy company in Liechtenstein could hide, and that no amount of overspending could ever burn through. Something that was, quietly, worth more than every house and car and diamond he ever owned combined. His name, Diego Maradona, was not just a person. He was a brand, one of the most valuable brands in the history of sport. And while the cash disappeared and the debts piled up, the name kept its power. The name could sell shirts and shoes and video games forever. The name was the real fortune. The problem was when Diego died, the children discovered a horrifying thing. That name, the single most valuable thing he owned, was not sitting safely in their hands. It was in someone else's. The man who owned Maradona. Every great fight needs a villain, or at least someone the family was convinced was the villain. And in the war over Diego Maradona's fortune, that man had a name, Macias Morla. For the final years of his life, Morla was Diego's main lawyer, his legal representative, and the man who handled much of his business and personal affairs. He had not always been the man in charge. In Diego's early career, others managed his rise, including a longtime agent, who was there for the glory years and who passed away in 2017. Over time, the roles blurred, and Morla became the central figure. The gatekeeper, the fixer, the trusted inner circle, all in one man. If you wanted to reach Diego, you often had to go through Morla. If there was a deal to be made, Morla was in the room. And at the center of Morla's world sat a company. A quiet, unglamorous company with a strange name, Satvika. On its own, Satvika does not sound like much, but what it held was priceless. Because Satvika controlled the trademarks, it controlled the commercial rights to the name and image of Diego Maradona. And we are not talking about one or two trademarks. According to reports, this web covered around 246 brands, tied to his name, his nicknames, and his most iconic moments. Think about what that means. The word Maradona as a brand you could stamp on clothing and shoes. The nickname D10S, a clever play on the Spanish word for God and his number 10. The phrase La Mano de Dios, the hand of God, the name of his most infamous goal. All of it registered, packaged, and controlled through a company connected to his lawyer. Every one of those marks was a little money machine. A right to sell products, license his image, and cash in on the most beloved name in the country, potentially forever. And these were not just marks on a shelf gathering dust. Trademarks like these can cover clothing, footwear, restaurants and bars, technology. All the ways a famous name gets turned into cash. Put his face on a shirt, open a Maradona-themed venue, license his likeness to a video game. Slap D10S on a line of sneakers. Each of those is money, and there was almost no limit to how the name could be stretched across products around the globe. That is the reason this was worth fighting over when the houses and cars were not. A car sells once, a name can sell forever. And whoever controlled those trademarks controlled the one part of Diego Maradona that would never stop earning. And sit with that number for a moment. Hundreds of trademarks. One human being, sliced up into more than 200 separate registered brands. Each one a legal right that could be licensed, sold, or fought over on its own. Most people go their whole lives without owning a single trademark. Diego had a library of them, all built on the different pieces of his fame. And that is exactly what made this so impossible to untangle after he died. It was not one asset you could hand to the kids and be done. It was a sprawling web, spread across products and countries, wrapped inside a company owned by other people, with deals already signed and money already moving. Trying to sort out who owned what and who was owed what was like trying to unpick a knot that had been tied tighter and tighter for years, and nobody left instructions on how to do it. Where did the control come from? Reports point to a set of documents from around 2015, authorizations that handed commercial use of the brand to the company. And Morla was not alone. Around the company sat a small circle of trusted names. A brother-in-law of the lawyer, another associate, even a notary who handled paperwork. On paper, the company was owned and run by these people, not by Diego. But here is the strange, slippery heart of it. While all of that was true on paper, many believed Diego was still the one really calling the shots, still directing what happened with his own brand, even as the legal ownership sat with others. So which was it? Was Satvika a genuine business Diego chose to build with people he trusted? Or was it a shell, a convenient front, with his name quietly funneled into hands that were not his own? That single question, alive or on paper, is what the whole war would eventually turn on. While Diego was alive, this could be waved away. He was the boss, people said, and Morla just handled the paperwork. The company was simply a tool to manage the business, to sign the deals, to keep the machine running. Nothing sinister. Just how a busy superstar operated. But then Diego died, and suddenly the paperwork was not so simple anymore. Because now the most valuable thing he owned, his own name, was locked inside a company that his children did not control. And the man who did control it was not planning to just hand it over. You can imagine how that landed with his daughters. Dalma and Janina, the two daughters from Diego's marriage, had already been at the center of the family drama for years. They were vocal, they were sharp, and they were furious. They hired heavy legal firepower, including a well-known Argentine lawyer to fight their corner. And when they looked at Satvika and the trademarks and Maisha's, Morla sitting on top of it all, they did not see a helpful lawyer. They saw a theft in progress. Their accusation was blunt and it was serious. They claimed fraud. They argued that the arrangement, handing commercial control to Satvika, was never legitimate, that their father had not knowingly signed away the rights to his own legacy, and that the whole structure was a front where the real Maradona brand belonged to Diego, and by law to his children, while the paper said something else entirely. Part of their argument was even more pointed. They suggested that in his final years, Diego was in no fit state to be signing the rights to his own name, that he was too unwell, too vulnerable, for those transfers to be treated as the clear choice of a healthy man. And the piece that made them angriest was what happened after death. In their eyes, control of the name did not just stay with Morla by accident. It stayed with him so that the profits kept flowing to the wrong people, the lawyer and his associates, while the actual heirs, the children, got shut out of their own father's fortune. Morla saw it differently, of course. His position was that the arrangements were legal, that the documents were real, and that he had been Diego's trusted partner for years. From his side, he was the one who had stood by Diego, who had managed things properly, and who was now being attacked by a family that wanted to rewrite history. So here is where the two stories collide. The children say the name was stolen from them through a fake structure signed by a sick man. The lawyer says he legally held the keys and did nothing wrong. And between those two stories sat a fortune in trademarks that could earn money forever. And Morla did the one thing guaranteed, to turn a family feud into a full-blown war. He refused to simply transfer the trademarks to the heirs. He held the line. He kept control. And that refusal is what pushed this fight out of a private family matter and into courtrooms around the world. And here is something worth filing away. Maisha's Morla was not only the man at the center of the brand war. He had been close to Diego in those final months, part of the world around him when everything fell apart. That means the same name tangled up in the fight over the fortune would also brush up against the much darker investigation into how Diego actually died. One man, two of the biggest questions of this entire story. That is how central and how controversial he became. But to really understand why the children were so ready to believe the worst, you have to understand something else. The war did not start when Diego died. The cracks in this family had been there for years, splitting open in public for everyone to see. Because Diego, for all his genius, was a complicated father. and the last few years of his life were a mess of feuds, silences, and public accusations. That set the stage for everything that came after. His daughters had clashed with him bitterly. There were long stretches where they barely spoke, and the fights did not stay behind closed doors. They played out in the media, on television, and on social media. A superstar and his grown children airing years of hurt in public for the whole country to watch. Money, loyalty, the people he surrounded himself with, all of it became fuel for feuds that flared up again and again in his final years. And as his health got worse, Janina and others began pointing fingers at the people around him. The entourage, the handlers, the very inner circle that included the men who controlled his brand. They accused those people of keeping the family away, of controlling access to Diego, of shaping his final years for their own benefit. In fact, one of the most chilling ideas that came out of the later investigations was that in his final stretch, Diego was shielded by the people around him, cut off, managed, and controlled at the exact moment he was most vulnerable. Whether that was protection or something darker became one of the biggest questions of all. And it got personal in ways that fed directly into the money fight. At one point, during a bad stretch with his family, Diego reportedly threatened to donate much of his wealth to charity, to cut his own children out, to give it all away rather than let them have it. It was the kind of thing a hurt, angry man says in the heat of a fight. But when he died with no will at all, that threat suddenly took on a whole new meaning. Had he really meant it? Was that why there was nothing written down? Or was it just noise from a broken relationship? Nobody could ask him. That was the whole problem. The one person who could have explained what he wanted was gone, and he had left no instructions behind. Just a name worth a fortune, a lawyer who would not let go of it, and a set of children who were convinced they had been robbed. And for the daughters, this was never only about money. Understand that. Yes, the trademarks were worth a fortune, and yes, they wanted what the law said was theirs. But there was something deeper burning underneath. This was their father's name, their family name, the name they carried, the name their children would carry. The idea that the most sacred thing Diego ever built, his legacy, could be owned, licensed, and cashed in by people outside the family was not just a financial insult to them, it was personal. It felt like watching strangers walk off with a piece of their dad. And that is a fight people do not give up. Not after one loss, not after 10. That is a fight you take to the ends of the earth, which is exactly what they were about to do. So the daughters did the only thing left to do. They lawyered up and they went to war. Not just in Argentina, but everywhere Diego's name had value. And it turned out his name had value in a lot of places. The fight was about to leave Buenos Aires and travel across an ocean. To courtrooms in Spain, to courtrooms in the United Kingdom, to panels of judges who had never met Diego Maradona but would now decide who truly owned him. And in one of those faraway courtrooms, the family was about to make a discovery. That turned an already ugly fight into something much worse. Because when they pulled on the thread of who was quietly working against them, who was filing claims and grabbing at the brand, they found a face they never expected to see on the other side. It was not just the lawyer anymore. It was blood, betrayal, frozen accounts, and a golden ball that vanished. The children of Diego Maradona had a decision to make: fight the lawyer at home in Argentina, where things moved slowly and the family history was messy, or chase the fortune where it actually lived, in the trademark offices and courts of Europe. They chose to fight everywhere at once, and slowly the tide began to turn. The first big win came in Europe. Diego had registered his name as a trademark across the European Union years earlier, which meant the rights to Maradona as a brand were governed, not just by Argentine law, but by European law too. And when the dispute reached the European courts, the judges looked closely at the documents that Satvica had used to claim control. What they found mattered enormously. In 2023, a European court effectively ruled that those documents did not do what the lawyer's side claimed they did. The papers were treated as licenses, permissions to use the brand, not a true transfer of ownership. And under the law, when Diego died, ownership of his name passed to his heirs automatically by what is called universal succession. In plain words, the court said the name belonged to the children. Not the company, not the lawyer, the children. Why did this matter so much? because those image and name rights were the real treasure, the piece of the estate that could keep paying out year after year. Trademarks like these can drive merchandise, video games, endorsements, and branded products, and experts believed they could be worth serious money every single year if handled well. This was not a one-time payday. This was the engine that could fund the family for generations. That is why both sides were willing to fight for it across continents. And that word, continents, is not an exaggeration, because Diego's name was registered and valuable in different countries. The war had to be fought in different legal systems at the same time. A win in one country did not automatically mean a win everywhere. The heirs had to chase the brand through Argentine courts, through European Union bodies, through the United Kingdom, each with its own rules, its own judges, its own timeline. It was slow, it was expensive. It meant lawyers in multiple languages and rulings that could take years to arrive. For a grieving family, it was an exhausting, grinding fight on a dozen fronts at once, against a lawyer who would not budge and, as they were about to discover, against people even closer to home. But little by little, courtroom by courtroom, the strangers in robes kept reaching the same conclusion. The name belonged to the children. But that win in Europe was not the whole war, because the fight was also raging in the United Kingdom. And it was there that the family learned the most painful lesson of all. In the United Kingdom, the heirs faced off against a rival attempt to grab Maradona trademarks. And in 2025, the children won a landmark ruling. The Intellectual Property Office there sided with them, blocking the rival applications and citing bad faith. Another win, another courtroom where a panel of strangers agreed that the name of Diego Maradona belonged to his kids. But here is the gut punch. Who was behind that rival attempt in the United Kingdom? Not just the lawyer. The trail led to a company linked to Maradona's own sisters. His sisters, Diego's own blood. The aunts of the very children who were fighting to protect their father's legacy. According to the reports, 2 of Diego's sisters had been drawn deep into the world of Satvika and the Maradona brand, with shares in the company connected to them. And now the children were not just fighting a lawyer, they were fighting their own family. Imagine sitting in that courtroom. On one side, the children burying their father and defending his name. On the other side, in one way or another, their own aunts. This was no longer a business dispute. This was a family eating itself alive over a dead man's brand. And think about what that does to a family forever. These were not strangers. These were Diego's sisters, the children's blood, people who had sat at the same tables, celebrated the same triumphs, and grieved the same man. Whatever bond had held them together, the fight over Diego's name shattered it. When the dust settled, there was no version of this where everyone hugged and moved on. Some wounds do not close. A nephew who loved his aunt, a niece who trusted hers, all of it poisoned by lawyers, seizures, and accusations of fraud. This is the part the headlines sometimes miss. A tangled fortune does not just cost money. It costs relationships that can never be rebuilt. It takes a family and quietly, permanently, breaks it into pieces. And Argentina was not going to sit quietly while Europe handed down rulings. Back home, the authorities had been building a case of their own. And in 2025, it landed hard. Argentine courts moved against the whole group. They seized around $1.3 million in assets from Morla, from his associates, and from 2 of Maradona's sisters, Rita and Claudia, as part of a fraud investigation into how the brand had been managed. And it was not just the lawyer and the sisters. The net pulled in associates connected to the operation, the people who had helped run the machine, including a relative of the lawyer and a notary tied to the paperwork. This was starting to look less like a family squabble and more like an organized case of alleged fraud, with the children cast as the victims. Then came the moment that made it all official. In 2026, it was confirmed that Diego's lawyer and 2 of his sisters would stand trial for allegedly profiting improperly from his trademarks, for allegedly defrauding the legitimate heirs through the very structure that had controlled his name. A lawyer and 2 sisters headed to court, accused of stealing from the children of Diego Maradona. The picture painted by the heirs was of a machine that simply refused to switch off. In their telling, even after Diego was gone, the brand kept getting used, deals kept getting made, and profits kept flowing, all while the children who legally owned the name were pushed to the sidelines. That is why so much of this fight was about control on paper, about who held the trademarks, who could authorize a deal, and who got the check when a Maradona product sold. As the legal wins stacked up for the children, the courts increasingly moved to shut down the old arrangement, to strip control from the company and its people and hand it back to the heirs. Piece by piece, the machine was being taken apart. Now, and this matters, none of them has been convicted of these accusations. They are entitled to defend themselves, and a trial is not a verdict. But the simple fact that it reached this point, family members, and a trusted lawyer facing trial over a dead legend's brand, tells you just how deep and how bitter this had become. And here is the thing about a fortune this tangled. The trademark war was only one front. Because once you start pulling on the money threads around Diego Maradona, more of them keep coming loose. Older threads, stranger threads, threads that had been fraying long before he ever died. Take the story of his ex-wife. Claudia Villafani was Diego's wife for years, the mother of his two eldest daughters, and for a long time, one of the people closest to his money. But their split was not clean, and the money made it worse. Back in 2015, while Diego was still alive, he accused Claudia of taking millions from him, claiming she had moved money without his consent and used it to buy property in Miami. The reported amounts varied, running into the millions. There were also fierce disputes over a huge collection of his memorabilia. Hundreds of precious items, jerseys, trophies, and keepsakes worth a fortune to collectors, with a bitter fight over who really owned them and where they had gone. A judge even moved to freeze her assets. For a while, it looked like Diego might drag the mother of his two eldest daughters through the mud and win. It sounded explosive, missing millions, secret properties, a superstar accusing his own ex-wife of robbing him blind. But then the case ran its course. Claudia denied everything, pushed back hard, and in the end, the United States courts ruled in her favor, finding no evidence to support the claims. What looked like a smoking gun turned into smoke. And here is the twist within the twist. After Diego died, that same ex-wife, once accused of stealing from him, became one of the loudest voices demanding justice for how he was treated in his final days. The family lines in this story never stayed where you expected them to. And then there is maybe the strangest treasure of all, the Golden Ball. In 1986, Diego won the Golden Ball as the best player at the World Cup, the tournament where he became immortal. It was one of the most precious trophies in his entire life. And at some point, it simply vanished. For decades, nobody knew where it was, and in the absence of facts, the stories grew wild. Some said it had been stolen by the mafia. Some said Diego had lost it in a poker game, gambled away in a bad night. Others whispered it had disappeared in a bank robbery back in Naples, swept up with everything else in some vault. A World Cup golden ball, gone like a ghost, wrapped in rumors of gangsters and gambling debts. And then, years later, it reappeared. After all those decades in the dark, the golden ball surfaced, apparently headed for an auction block in Europe with a price tag attached. And the moment it did, the heirs sprang into action, moving to stop the sale, and arguing the trophy had been stolen and never should have been up for auction in the first place. Think about how that captures the whole saga. A trophy that vanished for a generation, wrapped in rumors of mobsters and card games, suddenly popping back up for sale, and immediately triggering yet another Maradona lawsuit. Even his trophies, it turned out, could not escape the tangle. Even his gold ended up in a courtroom. There was even a wider cloud of suspicion. Diego's career and life had touched so many countries: Argentina, Italy, Spain, the Middle East, Belarus, Mexico, Cuba, that rumors swirled about hidden accounts and secret assets stashed somewhere. In that global trail, in truth, no giant secret treasure was ever pulled out of the shadows and confirmed. The real story was messier and more human than buried gold. It was mismanagement, debts, disputes, and a name too valuable for anyone to release their grip on. So look at the full picture now. A war over his name in Europe. A war over his name in the United Kingdom. A fraud trial at home involving a lawyer and two sisters. Old accusations against an ex-wife. A missing golden trophy dragged out of the shadows and into a lawsuit. This was not one dispute. It was a dozen disputes, all burning at once, all fed by the same fuel. A fortune with no will, no clear owner, and a name too valuable for anyone to let go. His children were fighting the lawyer. They were fighting their aunts. Old wounds with their mother's side were being torn back open. The whole family and the whole inner circle was at war on every front imaginable. And through all of it, one enormous, painful question hung over everything, growing louder by the year. Was Diego Maradona's death itself part of this story? Because at the same time, the family was fighting over his fortune. A completely separate courtroom was asking a much darker question, not who gets the money, but whether the people around Diego, the same kind of inner circle now accused of chasing his brand, had let him die. And that trial was about to reveal something about the last hours of his life that no one in that family would ever be able to forget. The trial, the truce, and what he truly left behind. While the family tore itself apart over money, there was another courtroom. And in that courtroom, the question was not about dollars or trademarks. It was about how Diego Maradona actually died. And what came out of it was harder to hear than anything about the fortune. Because when the doctors looked at his body, they did not find the death of a man who slipped away peacefully in his sleep. They found evidence of something far worse. Start with his heart. When they weighed it, Diego's heart came in at around 503 grams, close to double the weight of a normal adult heart. It was swollen, damaged, and failing. This was a man in serious trouble, a man whose body was screaming for help. And the accusation at the center of the case is that the people paid to watch him did not listen. The autopsy told a story of slow suffering, not a sudden bolt from the blue. Experts pointed to fluid that had been building in his body for days. Swelling in the brain, clotting around the heart, and fluid in the lungs. All signs of a system shutting down piece by piece over time. And there is one detail here that surprises a lot of people, because it cuts against the easy assumption. When they tested his body, there were no drugs and no alcohol in his system. For a man whose demons had been public for decades, that finding mattered. This was not a case of a wild night gone wrong. This was a sick man, clean at the end, whose body was failing in plain sight, while the people around him, according to prosecutors, failed to act. The last person reported to have seen him alive was a nephew. In a quiet house, on an ordinary morning that became the day a nation stopped. Argentine prosecutors charged 7 medical professionals, with others drawn in as well, in connection with his death. Among them, his neurosurgeon Leopoldo Luque, who had performed his brain surgery, and his psychiatrist Agustina Kosachov. But the list did not stop there. It reached a psychologist, a medical coordinator, a nursing coordinator, another physician, and the nurses responsible for his day-to-day care, with one nurse facing a separate jury trial of her own. A whole team, all accused in the death of one man. The charge was essentially a form of homicide, the claim being that they knew their care was dangerously inadequate and carried on anyway. A medical board that reviewed his care did not soften its words. They described the treatment he received as inappropriate, deficient, and reckless. And prosecutors laid out a scene that was hard to stomach. A home set up as a makeshift hospital, but without the equipment, or monitoring a man in his condition desperately needed. Reports described a dirty environment, missing basic medical gear, and care so careless that his true state went unnoticed. A patient who was not properly watched, warning signs that should have been caught and were not. One prosecutor was brutal in describing the team, calling them a bunch of amateurs who committed all kinds of omissions. And the most haunting claim of all was about timing. Forensic experts came to believe that Diego did not die in an instant. They estimated he had been slowly dying for around 12 hours before he was found, showing signs of an agonizing decline that, they argued, should have been obvious to anyone actually paying attention. In the harshest telling, he had essentially been abandoned to his fate. The prosecution's point was simple and devastating. His medical team could have saved his life. A proper hospital, proper monitoring, a timely transfer. Any of it might have given the world a few more years with El Diego. The defendants deny wrongdoing. They argue that Diego was a gravely ill man with a long history of heart trouble and addiction, that his death was the tragic end of years of damage, and that home care was what he actually wanted. That fight has been long and emotional, with more than 100 witnesses called to the stand. Diego's own daughters testified, a former partner testified. Support workers who had been near him in those last weeks described what they saw. And the picture they painted was grim, a chaotic home, a man cut off from the people who loved him, and an inner circle that controlled who got close. It is worth sitting with that for a second, because it echoes the money story in a chilling way. The same theme keeps returning, that in his final years, Diego Maradona was managed, guarded, and controlled by the people around him, while his family stood on the outside looking in. Whether the subject was his brand or his life, the accusation had the same shape. And in a twist that feels almost too strange to be real, the case has been a disaster in the courtroom itself. The first trial collapsed in 2025 when one of the judges was thrown off the case. The reason was jaw-dropping. She had reportedly been involved in a secret documentary about the very trial she was overseeing, a project that reeked of a conflict of interest. The whole thing was annulled, and everyone had to start over. A retrial began in the spring of 2026 in a criminal court in the San Isidro district, outside Buenos Aires, with hearings held twice a week. There were emotional scenes, painful testimony, and even autopsy footage shown to the room, forcing the people who loved Diego to relive his worst moments in open court. And still, even as the calendar pushed past the middle of 2026, there was no final verdict. It had been expected around mid-year, then looked like it might slide even later. The case simply ground on, and the family kept waiting for an answer to the only question that could ever bring them peace. Could their father have been saved? And remember, everyone charged is presumed innocent unless a court says otherwise, which is exactly why this has taken so long and cut so deep. So think about what these children were carrying. On one side, a war over their father's fortune, against his lawyer and their own aunts. On the other side, a courtroom trying to decide whether the people around Diego had let him die in agony. Grief and greed tangled together, dragging on for years with no clean ending. It would have been easy for this family to shatter completely, to let the money and the accusations and the trials finish the job and leave them scattered forever. And for a long time, that looked like exactly where it was heading. But then something happened that almost nobody saw coming. The children stopped fighting each other. After years of public clashes, after all the bitterness between them, the recognized heirs finally reached a truce around late 2025. They stopped pulling in different directions and started pulling together. And once they did, the thing that had torn them apart became the thing that united them. His name, now that they had won back control of the trademarks in Europe and in the United Kingdom. Now that the courts had confirmed the brand belonged to them and not to the lawyer, the children could finally do something with it. Together, they moved to actually manage and protect the Maradona brand, even reaching a deal with an outside branding company to build official Maradona products the right way, with the whole group of heirs standing behind it. Think about the distance traveled here. These were people who had spent years accusing each other, dragging their grievances across television screens and social media feeds, barely able to be in the same room. And now they were partners, signing the same contracts, protecting the same name. The very fortune that had set sister against child and family against lawyer became the reason they finally sat at the same table. It did not fix everything. The broader estate, the properties, the leftover debts, the paternity claims, the endless probate. Much of that was still crawling through the courts, and the trial over his death still hung over all of them like a cloud. But something fundamental had shifted. The children had stopped seeing each other as the enemy. They had figured out who the real fight was against, and they had won the part that mattered most. But winning back the Maradona name did not mean the nightmare was over. Far from it, the broader estate remained tangled in the courts. Questions over properties, unpaid debts, inheritance claims, and the true value of what Diego had left behind continued to drag on. Every new ruling seemed to answer one question while creating another. For the family, there was no single day when they could finally close the chapter and move on. And perhaps that was the saddest part of all. Instead of remembering Diego only as the football genius who inspired millions, his children spent years sitting in lawyers' offices, reading court documents, responding to fraud allegations, and defending the very legacy he had spent a lifetime building. Birthdays, anniversaries, and tributes to their father were repeatedly overshadowed by another hearing, another lawsuit, another headline about the Maradona estate. The tragedy is that almost every major battle they fought could have been avoided. A clear will, a transparent estate plan, a straightforward ownership structure for his image rights. Those simple decisions could have spared the family years of public accusations and private heartbreak. Instead, every unanswered question Diego left behind became someone else's fight to resolve. And while the courts slowly untangled the legal mess, the emotional damage was far harder to repair. Relationships had already been broken, trust had already disappeared. Some family members found themselves on opposite sides of courtrooms across 3 different countries, arguing over the name of the man they all claimed to love. Even after legal victories began to arrive, nobody truly walked away feeling like they had won. And that brings us all the way back to the question this whole story started with. The title, Diego Maradona left behind a fortune, so tangled it tore his family apart. Is that actually true? Here is the honest answer, and it is more surprising than the myth. The fortune everyone pictured, the mountains of cash, the loaded bank accounts, the piles of gold, that fortune was mostly a ghost. By the time he died, the money had been spent, given away and swallowed by a tax war that lasted 30 years. On paper, one of the richest names in football history was worth about $500,000, and his belongings could barely be sold at auction. In terms of cold hard cash, there was shockingly little to fight over. But the real fortune was never the cash. It was the name, Maradona as a brand, was worth more than every house and car and diamond he ever owned. And because he died with no will, no plan, and that priceless name locked inside a company he did not fully control, that intangible treasure became a weapon. It set off a 5-year war across 3 continents, dragged his own sisters into a fraud trial, reopened old wounds with his ex-wife, and pitted his grieving children against nearly everyone in his inner circle. So yes, the fortune was real, and it did tear the family apart, but not in the way the myth suggests. It was not stacks of money that broke them. It was a name so valuable and so badly protected that it turned love into lawsuits. And here is the final twist, the part that makes this story land. That same name in the end is also what stitched the family back together. The thing that tore them apart became the thing that forced them to unite. His children walked through years of war, and they came out the other side, holding the one piece of their father. That could never be seized, never be spent, and never truly be taken from them. His legacy, which leaves one last lesson, and it is the biggest one of all. Diego Maradona rose from a dirt-poor shantytown with absolutely nothing, and he climbed higher than almost anyone in the history of his sport. He earned world record fees, a king's salary, and the adoration of an entire nation. He could do things with a ball that looked like magic. But there was one small, simple thing he never did. He never wrote down what he wanted. No will, no plan, no instructions. Just a few furious words in the heat of a family feud. And then silence, and that single missing piece of paper turned his final gift to his children into a 5-year nightmare of courts, fraud trials, frozen accounts, and betrayal by blood. The greatest player who ever lived left behind not a fortune, but a warning. That genius on the field means nothing if you leave chaos behind you, and that the most valuable thing you own might not be your money at all. It might be your name. If this story pulled you in, tell me one thing in the comments. Do you think Diego's children truly won in the end? Or did they lose the moment they had to fight this hard for what should have been theirs all along? Drop your answer below if you enjoyed watching this video. Click on one of the boxes